What would you do if your neighbor decided they didn't like you, and made it their mission to ruin your life? Ethan Parker wasn't thinking about neighborhood drama when he bought his dream home. He had spent years saving up, working as a freelance photographer, pouring his energy into a career that allowed him the freedom to work on his own terms. When he finally signed the papers for a charming house in a quiet, upscale neighborhood, he thought he had found the perfect place to settle down. It wasn't a mansion, but it was exactly what he wanted, just enough space for his photography equipment, a neat front yard, and a cozy back patio where he could enjoy his morning coffee in peace. He was finally home. At least, that's what he thought. Ethan's first few days in the neighborhood were uneventful. He spent his time unpacking, setting up his editing studio, and enjoying the simple pleasure of working without interruption. One of the best things about being his own boss was that he could dress however he wanted. His friends often joked that he was allergic to real pants because of his habit of wearing nothing but boxers and an old t-shirt while working from home. To Ethan, comfort was king, and since he wasn't expecting visitors, he didn't see the point in dressing up. Then he met Marge Whitman. It was a warm Saturday morning, and Ethan was outside trimming the bushes in his front yard when he heard the distinct click-click-click of approaching heels on pavement. He glanced up to see a petite woman in her 60s, her silver hair perfectly styled, a clipboard tucked firmly under her arm. Everything about her, from her floral print blouse to her overly crisp slacks, radiated control. Even before she spoke, Ethan could tell she was the type of person who believed rules were sacred, order was everything, and she was the one who got to enforce it. "Good morning," she chirped, her voice carrying the practiced politeness of someone who wasn't actually interested in exchanging pleasantries. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow and gave her a nod. "Morning. Can I help you with something?" Marge's gaze flicked over his outfit, her expression tightening ever so slightly. Ethan barely concealed an amused smirk. He had met people like her before, self-appointed neighborhood royalty, the kind of person who thought they ran the world just because they had a title. "I'm Marge Whitman," she said, shifting her clipboard into a firmer grip. "I live next door, and I'm also the head of our HOA. I wanted to introduce myself and make sure you're aware of our community standards." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Community standards?" Marge's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yes. We take pride in maintaining a certain image here. It's important that all homeowners reflect the values of our neighborhood." Her eyes flicked to his plaid boxers again, a subtle but clear disapproval tightening her mouth. "So that's what this is about." Ethan let out a low chuckle. "I'm sure I'll fit in just fine. Thanks for stopping by." He turned back to his bushes, hoping that was the end of it. It wasn't. Marge lingered. "I also noticed you don't have curtains on your front windows yet," she continued. "Privacy is important, you know. You wouldn't want the whole neighborhood seeing what you do inside." Ethan stiffened. The way she said it, like a warning, not a suggestion, set off alarm bells in his head. "I'll keep that in mind," he replied, his patience thinning. Who was this woman to tell him how to live in his own home? Marge finally took the hint and stepped back, but not before offering a final parting shot. "I hope to see you at our next HOA meeting. Attendance is encouraged." With that, she strode off, clipboard in hand, like a general inspecting her troops. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. He had dealt with difficult people before, but something about Marge unsettled him. She wasn't just nosy, she carried herself like someone who truly believed she had the power to dictate the lives of others. He brushed off the encounter and went about his day, figuring that was the last he'd have to deal with her. He couldn't have been more wrong. Ethan had hoped that after their brief conversation, Marge would leave him alone. But by the following week, it became painfully clear that she wasn't going anywhere. At first, it was the small things, little passive-aggressive gestures that might have been innocent if they hadn't happened over and over again. His trash cans, which he always placed neatly by the curb on pickup days, started getting mysteriously knocked over in the mornings, their contents spilling onto the pavement. The first time, he assumed it was the wind. The second time, maybe a raccoon. By the third time, he knew better. The lid wasn't just thrown off, it was placed neatly beside the bin, as if someone had deliberately done it. Then there were the footprints in his flower bed. Too large to belong to an animal, too fresh to be from before he moved in. And there was the unmistakable feeling of being watched. At night, he would catch glimpses of movement through his blinds, the shadow of someone standing on the sidewalk, motionless, just staring at his house. Every time he turned to look, the figure would disappear. One evening, while locking up for the night, he spotted Marge at the edge of her yard, arms crossed, watching him with narrowed eyes. She didn't wave. She didn't look away. She just stood there, a smug little smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth, as if daring him to confront her. Ethan refused to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. He wasn't about to play her game. But that decision was taken out of his hands the morning he found the note. It was taped to his front door, written in blocky, deliberate handwriting, "Your behavior is inappropriate. Consider this a warning." Ethan's stomach twisted as he read the words. This was no longer just an overbearing neighbor making snide remarks, this was a direct threat. She wasn't just watching him. She wanted him gone. He crumpled the note in his fist, his pulse hammering. He wasn't going to let some bitter old woman bully him into submission. That evening, he installed security cameras. He wasn't the type to paranoia watch his property, but something told him Marge was the kind of person who wouldn't stop until she was caught in the act. At first, things seemed to settle. The trash cans remained upright, the note stopped, and Marge wasn't lurking in the shadows, at least, not visibly. Ethan almost allowed himself to believe she had finally gotten bored of her little power trip. Then the police showed up. It was early afternoon, and Ethan was in the middle of an editing session when the sharp knock at his door made him jolt. He opened it to find two uniformed officers standing on his porch, their expressions unreadable. "Mr. Parker," one of them asked, his voice professional but firm. Ethan frowned. "Yeah, that's me. What's going on?" "We received an anonymous complaint about possible illegal business activity at this address. We need to ask you some questions." For a moment, Ethan just stared at them, his brain struggling to process what he had just heard. "Illegal business activity," he repeated. "You mean, wait, what?" The second officer flipped through a notepad. "The report states that you've been running an unlicensed business from your home. There were concerns about suspicious photography-related activity." Ethan's jaw clenched. Photography-related activity. His fingers curled into fists at his sides as realization hit him like a freight train. This was Marge. This had her smug, controlling fingerprints all over it. "Look," Ethan exhaled sharply, keeping his voice level, "I'm a professional photographer. That's my job. I have clients, I edit photos, I do shoots in the city, but I'm not running some underground operation out of my house." The officers exchanged a glance. "Do you mind if we take a look inside?" Ethan should have said no. He knew he had every right to refuse without a warrant, but he also knew how this worked. The second he pushed back, it would only make him look more suspicious. "Fine," he muttered, stepping aside. As they moved through his home, Ethan felt exposed, like a criminal in his own house. They checked his office, his computer, his camera equipment, asking questions that felt less like protocol and more like accusations. After nearly 20 minutes, they finally seemed satisfied that he wasn't running some shady operation. One of the officers sighed. "Everything checks out, Mr. Parker. Sorry for the inconvenience, but we have to follow up on complaints like this." "Right," Ethan muttered, jaw tight. "Let me guess, this complaint came from Marge Whitman?" The officers didn't confirm it, but their pointed silence was confirmation enough. As soon as they left, Ethan shut the door, pressing his fingers against his temples. This wasn't just some annoying neighbor dispute anymore. She was weaponizing the system against him. He pulled up his security camera feed, rewinding to that morning. And there she was, Marge, standing outside her house, watching smugly as the police arrived, arms crossed over her chest like she had just won a game only she was playing. Ethan's blood boiled. She wanted war? Fine. She was about to find out just how much he hated losing. Ethan barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the smug expression on Marge's face as the officers left his house. She had called the police on him, weaponized authority, and there were no consequences for her lies. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of it all pressing down on him. How far was she willing to go? The answer came sooner than he expected. 2 days later, a loud pounding on his front door jolted him from his morning coffee. He sighed, already guessing who it was. Maybe this time she'd brought the HOA board along for backup. But when he opened the door, it wasn't Marge. It was the police. Again. Ethan's stomach dropped. This time, there were 3 officers, and their expressions were far more serious than the ones before. "Mr. Parker, we received a report about a violent altercation on your property," one of them said, already stepping forward as if expecting to see blood on the floor. Ethan's pulse roared in his ears. "What? What are you talking about?" "A neighbor reported screams and loud crashing sounds coming from inside your house," the officer continued. "We need to investigate." Ethan felt like he was drowning in slow motion. "That's impossible," he said, shaking his head. "I live alone. No one's been here all morning." The officers didn't seem convinced. "Do you mind if we take a look around?" He did. He absolutely did. But refusing now would only make things worse. With a clenched jaw, he stepped aside. As the officers moved through his house, checking the living room, the kitchen, even the back patio, Ethan's mind raced. There was no altercation, no noise, no crime. This was another setup. And then they found it. One of the officers stopped at the back door, frowning. "Sir, did you notice this?" Ethan turned, and his blood ran ice cold. The window was shattered, glass littering the floor inside his kitchen. What the hell? Ethan stepped forward, his mind scrambling for answers. That wasn't broken when he went to bed. And then he saw the smears of red near the frame. Blood. Or something that looked like it. A slow horror crept through his veins. This wasn't just a false police call, someone had staged a crime scene. Ethan spun toward the officers. This wasn't me. Someone did this to set me up." One of them glanced at his partner. "We're going to need you to answer some questions, Mr. Parker." Ethan barely heard the words. His hands curled into fists at his sides as his brain finally pieced it together. The shattered window. The fake blood. The anonymous 911 call. Marge. He had no proof, not yet, but there wasn't a doubt in his mind. She had done this. She had broken into his yard, faked a crime, and sent the police straight to his door. And they were buying it. An hour later, Ethan sat in the police station, answering the same questions over and over again. No, he didn't hear anything last night. No, he wasn't involved in an altercation. No, he had no idea why someone would target him. The officers seemed skeptical, but eventually, they let him go, citing a lack of actual victims. By the time Ethan got home, his pulse was still hammering, his stomach churning with rage. He stormed inside, yanked open his laptop, and pulled up his security footage. If Marge had done this, he was going to catch her in the act. His fingers flew over the trackpad as he scrubbed through the footage. Hours of stillness. The quiet of the neighborhood. And then, movement. His breath hitched. There she was. Marge Whitman, in the middle of the night, creeping toward his fence. Ethan watched, eyes burning, as she lifted something in her hands, a small plastic bag, dark liquid sloshing inside. She reached up, smeared it on the broken window frame. Then, with startling precision, she pulled a burner phone from her pocket and made a call. Ethan couldn't hear what she said, but he didn't need to. He knew exactly who she was calling. The cops. Ethan's hand shook with fury as he stared at the screen. She had set him up. And this time, he had proof. He uploaded the footage to a flash drive, grabbed his phone, and called his lawyer, Dan Calloway. Dan, Ethan said, his voice shaking. You need to see this footage. Marge, she staged a fake crime scene. She called the cops on me. This isn't just harassment anymore. She's trying to ruin my life. A pause on the other end. Then Dan's voice, calm but serious. Bring it to my office. Right now. Ethan didn't waste another second. This wasn't just a petty feud anymore. This was war. Ethan sat in Dan Calloway's office, his jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. The glow of the laptop screen illuminated both their faces as the footage played, the grainy black and white video of Marge Whitman smearing fake blood on his window, breaking the glass herself, and calling the police moments later. Ethan had watched it at least a dozen times, but each replay only made the anger simmer hotter in his chest. Dan leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. This is big, he said finally. This isn't just harassment. She framed you for a crime. This could carry serious charges, criminal mischief, filing a false police report, even trespassing if we push it. Ethan gripped the arms of his chair. So what do we do? Dan steepled his fingers. First thing, we file an emergency restraining order against her. She's escalating, and we need legal documentation that puts distance between you two. Second, we go to the police with this footage. Ethan exhaled, rubbing his temples. Do you think they'll actually do anything? Last time they barely seemed interested. They will now, Dan assured him. A false police report is one thing, but deliberately staging a crime scene? That's a whole different level of illegal. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a flicker of control returning to his life. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the moment where things would finally turn in his favor. But Marge wasn't done. That night, Ethan sat at his desk, editing a batch of photos for a client. His security system was armed, his doors locked, and the footage of Marge safely backed up in multiple locations. He wasn't going to be caught off guard again. Then, around 1:30 a.m., his security monitor lit up. The motion sensor in his backyard had been triggered. Ethan's stomach clenched as he clicked into the live feed. And there she was. Marge Whitman. But she wasn't alone this time. Two masked figures stood with her, dressed in dark clothing. One carried a crowbar, the other a gas canister. Ethan's blood turned to ice. For a few horrifying seconds, he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then his body snapped into action. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911, his voice shaking with adrenaline as he whispered, "There are 3 people in my backyard, one of them has a gas can. I think they're trying to burn my house down." The dispatcher's voice remained calm, but the urgency was clear. "Stay inside, lock your doors, and remain on the line. Officers are on their way." Ethan's heart hammered as he turned back to the monitor. Marge was pacing, waving something in her hand. A lighter. The 2 men were pouring gasoline along the fence line. Panic coiled around Ethan's throat. This wasn't just vandalism. This wasn't a scare tactic. She was actually trying to burn him out. Ethan knew he had minutes before the cops arrived. If Marge struck that lighter, he'd be watching his house go up in flames before they even turned onto the street. His hands trembled as he reached for the outdoor floodlight switch. With one flick, the entire backyard exploded in bright white light. Marge froze. The two men startled, turning toward the house. Ethan threw open the window, his voice roaring with fury. "Get the hell off my property!" For a second, nobody moved. Then the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. The men panicked first. One of them dropped the crowbar and bolted, vaulting over the fence in a desperate escape. The other hesitated, looking to Marge for instruction. But Marge stood still, staring at Ethan with a hatred so pure it sent a chill down his spine. She raised the lighter, her fingers gripping it so tightly they turned white. "You don't belong here," she hissed, her voice carrying over the yard. "You never did." Ethan's heart stopped as her thumb flicked the wheel of the lighter. Then, flashing red and blue lights flooded the street. Police cars screeched to a stop outside his house, their doors flying open as officers poured out, guns drawn. "Drop the lighter." Hands in the air. For the first time since he'd met her, Marge hesitated. The power she had wielded so carelessly over Ethan was crumbling beneath her feet. "Now!" Her fingers twitched. Then, with a frustrated scream, she let the lighter fall to the ground and raised her hands. The moment was surreal. Marge Whitman, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, the woman who had tormented him for months, was being shoved against a police car and handcuffed. The second masked man, who had waited too long to run, was pinned to the ground, his face shoved into the grass. The other was long gone, but Ethan didn't care. He had won. One of the officers approached him as the others secured the scene. "You okay?" Ethan let out a long, shaky breath, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline. "I will be," he admitted. The officer nodded, glancing back at Marge as she was shoved into the back of a patrol car. "She's in deep this time. Trespassing, vandalism, conspiracy, attempted arson. There's no walking away from this one." Ethan nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, he felt something unfamiliar. Relief. Marge had lost. And he was still standing. The morning after Marge's arrest, Ethan woke up to something he hadn't felt in months: silence. No pounding on his door, no police showing up at his house, no overturned trash cans or cryptic notes. For the first time since moving in, he could step outside without feeling like he was being watched. But as he stood on his porch, staring at the remnants of her failed destruction, the faint scent of gasoline still lingering in the air, the charred outline of where she had nearly set his fence ablaze, he realized just how close he had come to losing everything. Later that afternoon, his lawyer, Dan Calloway, called with an update. "They've charged her with multiple felonies," he said. "Trespassing, conspiracy, vandalism, filing false police reports, and attempted arson. And with the restraining order violations? She's looking at serious time." Ethan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "So that means she's not coming back?" Dan's voice carried a rare note of certainty. "She won't be seeing the outside of a courtroom for a long time." For the first time, Ethan let himself breathe. It was over. The news of Marge's arrest spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. At first, his neighbors kept their distance, unsure of where they stood, but soon, a shift began. One by one, people started coming forward. Frank Dawson, an older man who had lived on the street for years, knocked on his door one evening, holding a box of cookies like some kind of peace offering. "Look, Ethan," he said, shifting awkwardly. "I should have spoken up sooner. We all knew Marge was a nightmare, but she had the HOA wrapped around her finger. People were afraid of her." He sighed. "I guess we all just figured it was easier to keep our heads down." Ethan studied him for a moment before finally cracking a smile. "Well," he said, "at least you're here now." After that, the neighborhood changed. The HOA, once a weapon of control, started loosening its grip. People repainted their houses in whatever color they wanted. Someone even put up Halloween decorations in April, just to celebrate the end of Marge's reign. And Ethan? He finally finished settling into his home, no longer worried about what was lurking outside his window. Months later, he hosted a small gathering in his backyard, a way to reclaim the space that had once felt like a battleground. As laughter echoed under the soft glow of patio lights, he looked around at the people who had once been strangers, now coming together. Marge had spent years ruling through fear, but in the end, all she had left behind was a cautionary tale. Ethan took a sip of his beer, exhaling as he leaned back in his chair. He had won. This was his home. And no one, not Marge, not the HOA, not anyone, was ever going to take it from him again. But it made him wonder, how many others had gone through the same thing? Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.